A few days ago, I was sitting in a crowded tea stall in Dhaka just as the evening call to prayer began to echo over the city. A man at the next table, nursing a cup of Malai Shah, was staring intently at his phone. He turned it toward me, showing a grainy video of a massive crowd, thousands of people lining the streets, cheering as a motorcade passed by. "He's finally back," the man whispered, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and hope. 17 years. We thought we'd never see this soil under his feet again. He wasn't talking about a revolutionary hero from the history books, but Tariq Rahman, who had just returned from nearly 2 decades of exile in London. To this man, Tariq wasn't just a political leader. He was the living legacy of the Battle of the Begums, the son of the late Khalidazia, and the man poised to take the reins in the upcoming 2026 election. But as the conversation shifted to the future, the atmosphere in the stall changed. Someone mentioned the 2004 grenade attacks, a moment that shattered the fragile coexistence between the Awami League and the BNP. The man's face hardened. He didn't offer a policy platform or a manifesto. Instead, he spoke of survival and payback. To him, the exile of one leader and the death sentence of another weren't just legal rulings. They were scars of a decades-long war that had turned neighbors into enemies. That sudden shift from the euphoria of homecoming to the cold, hard logic of political retaliation is exactly where Bangladesh finds itself today. We are standing at a historic crossroads. For 30 years, the nation's pulse was dictated by the rivalry between two women, Sheikh Hasina and Khalidazia. Now, with Hasina in exile and Zia having just passed away, the battle of the Begums is over. But as the 2026 election approaches and a new generation prepares to vote for the time, a haunting question remains. Is Bangladesh finally ready to build a future based on coexistence, or are we simply watching the crown pass from the Begums to their bloodlines, only to start the cycle of vengeance all over again? That story from the tea stall, it just sets the stage so perfectly for this deep dive.
It really does. That shift from hope to vengeance. It's the core of the issue.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack all of this, the history, the institutions, the geopolitics that are shaping Bangladesh's future right now. We're moving from this crippling, decades-long rivalry to something new.
And something very uncertain. We're looking at a post-dynastic future, or at least that's the hope.
Right. And we've got a mountain of sources, legal analysis, sociological studies, articles to help us figure out what happens when these two colossal figures finally leave the stage.
And how the trauma they left behind and also endured is dictating what comes next. It's truly a moment of profound national psychological reset.
A psychological reset, that's a great way to put it.
For 40 years, the entire political framework of Bangladesh was just. It was defined by the conflict between Sheikh Hasina of the Awami League and Khalidazia of the BNP.
This wasn't just your standard political rivalry.
Not at all. It was the country's entire operating system. So to understand the future, we have to start by formally marking the end of that era, the end of the matriarchs.
Okay, let's dig into that. The Battle of the Begums. It sounds almost mythic now looking back.
It does. But it was the lived reality for millions.
Hasina, the daughter of the nation's founder, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman.
Versus Zia, the widow of the military ruler, Ziaur Rahman. They weren't just two-party leaders. They were these opposing foundational ideologies that have, dominated the country since the 1980s.
And now that era is definitively over.
It has reached its formal, definitive conclusion. And we can actually pinpoint it with 3 crucial, very recent dates that just seal this chapter of history.
Okay, what are they?
The first was back in August 2024. That's when Sheikh Hasina, after that massive public uprising, fled the country and went into exile in India. That was the political end.
The political removal, right. But the judicial seal came much later, didn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
November 2025. She was sentenced in absentia to 21 years in prison on a whole slate of corruption charges.
And that sentence basically cemented it. It made a return to power, even if her party somehow reorganized. Pretty much impossible.
Legally and politically impossible, yes. And then, just days before the new year, came the true symbolic end.
Khalidazia's passing.
Right. On December 30, 2025, Khalidazia died at the age of 80. After decades of everything, alternating power, prison, house arrest, this fierce, often violently destructive competition, the 2 figures who commanded the nation's attention are, for all intents and purposes, gone from the political stage.
It's really astonishing when you stop and think about it. One is convicted and in exile, the other is deceased. The significance of that for the upcoming 2026 election just can't be overstated. It will be the first general election in Bangladesh's history without either Sheikh Hasina or Khalidazia leading a major party.
The vacuum is immense.
It is a vacuum, but as they say, nature abhors a vacuum, especially in dynastic politics.
And that's where the transition of the torch becomes so critical. The political weight shifted immediately, even just days before Zia's death, with the highly symbolic return of her son, Tariq Rahman.
The current interim chairman of the BNP.
Exactly.
And he'd been gone for a very long time, nearly 2 decades.
17 years in exile in London. And the video clips you mentioned in the opening, I mean, the massive celebratory crowds, thousands upon thousands lining the streets in Dhaka.
The scale of that welcome, the pure ecstasy, it was an unambiguous signal, wasn't it?
It wasn't just a political rally. It was a cultural and psychological event. It was signaling a new beginning for the party's base. And the most powerful symbol, the one that resonates so deeply in Bangladesh.
The soil.
Him scooping up a handful of Bangladeshi soil right after he landed. After 17 years away, that gesture just underscored everything. His roots, his emotional connection, his commitment. It was a transformation from political pariah to, well, potential prime minister.
And the momentum around his return is palpable. He clearly understands the political moment. He didn't just come back quietly.
No, he came back with a powerful, forward-looking message. He called for unity, and then he delivered that highly anticipated statement.
I have a plan.
That phrasing is just crucial. It suggests a very calculated effort to step away from the historical binary that defined the last 4 decades.
Right. The old politics was just about whose dynasty you belong to, Mujib's or Zia's.
Exactly. And the new politics, or at least how Tariq is trying to frame it, has to be about performance and governance.
So the absence of the 2 Begums has really forced this.
Yeah.
This profound psychological reset you mentioned.
Precisely. For 4 decades, the entire political framework was their personal conflict. National goals, economic development, institutional stability, all of it was secondary to settling scores.
And now the public is just hungry for stability, for reform.
Desperately. This new generation of leadership, whether it's Tariq or the student movements we'll talk about, they know they had to deliver tangible results, not just another round of rivalry.
And this is the critical transition point, isn't it? The era of identity politics, centered on the bloodlines, is being forced to evolve into something focused on performance and structural change.
Especially with figures like Mohammed Yunus in the interim, pushing for those deep reforms.
But to really get why that evolution is so difficult, we have to understand just how deep the wounds are. We can't talk about escaping the rivalry without first understanding the historical poison that turned competition into vengeance.
You can't.
When you look at the last 20 years, it's so toxic, you almost assume the hostility was just permanent, that they were always fighting this existential war.
But that wasn't always the case. You know, there was a time when the rivalry was, well, it was political, but not yet existential. We have to trace that poison back to a time when a fragile kind of political courtesy actually existed.
So what did that look like?
We have to go back to the early 1990s. There was this limited but very significant period of coexistence. Both the Awami League and the BNP, they jointly led the massive anti-autocracy movement that finally got rid of President Ershad.
They were actually working together.
Within a joint political framework, yes. They mutually acknowledged each other's legitimacy despite their, deep ideological differences about the nation's founding.
There's that powerful anecdote from January 1988 that really captures that early sort of guarded respect.
Oh, yes. In '88, the police attacked Sheikh Hasina's motorcade in Chittagong, and it was a brutal event. The AL reported up to 80 casualties. It was widely seen as a direct assassination attempt.
And what was Khalidazia's response?
This is the amazing part. Despite their intense personal rivalry at the time, Khalidazia unexpectedly led a public protest march just days later, condemning the police firing on Hasina's convoy.
That gesture, condemning the attempted murder of your main political rival, it's just completely unimaginable in the context of the last 20 years.
Utterly unimaginable. It showed a baseline of mutual political recognition, a respect for the democratic process that just doesn't exist anymore.
There were other symbolic gestures too, right? In their personal lives.
Yeah, like Sheikh Hasina attending Tariq Rahman's wedding as an invited guest. These moments reinforced the idea that political competition hadn't totally devolved into the zero-sum enmity that came later. Senior figures would meet, there was restraint, even if the institutions themselves were already weak.
So if they shared a common goal in the 90s, if they showed this political courtesy, what was the singular event that just destroyed all of that trust, that ended any possibility of coexistence?
The decisive rupture. The event that turned rivalry into existential warfare. That was August 21st, 2004.
A grenade attack.
The horrific military-grade grenade attack on an Awami League rally in Dhaka. Military-grade grenades were hurled directly at the stage where Sheikh Hasina and her entire senior leadership were standing. 24 people were killed, hundreds were injured.
That detail about military-grade grenades, it says everything. This wasn't just some political disturbance.
No. It was targeted mass political murder. It was a direct, physical attempt to eliminate the entire leadership of the opposing party in one single blow.
And that event just permanently transformed everything.
It transformed democratic competition in Bangladesh into a battle for survival. When one side tries to physically eliminate the other, the political culture changes overnight. The stakes become life and death.
And as soon as the stakes shifted to survival, the state machinery, which is supposed to be neutral, it stopped being a tool for governance and just became a weapon.
A weapon for retaliation. That's the core mechanism of the poison. This event justified, at least in the minds of the victims, the cycle of arrests, disappearances, forced exile, and judicial manipulation that followed for the next 20 years.
Politics wasn't about winning elections anymore.
It became solely about securing power to survive.
And the judicial aftermath of that attack, even today, just shows how deep those scars are. The case itself has been used and manipulated by both sides for political gain. It's a legal morass.
It is. Let's look at that judicial trajectory. The initial trials, which were mostly under the Awami League government, they resulted in convictions in 2018, death sentences, life imprisonments for several suspects.
But those trials were hugely controversial.
Deeply controversial. The opposition always cited them as politically motivated. But the crucial defining moment for this new era came very recently, September 2025, when the Supreme Court issued a major ruling on the case.
What was the essence of that 2025 ruling?
The Supreme Court upheld an earlier High Court decision to acquit all 38 of the accused, including Tariq Rahman.
Wow. And their reasoning?
The court's reasoning was very clear. It ruled that the original trial was fundamentally legally flawed, that the confessional statements used as key evidence were inadmissible because of procedural abuses. The whole trial was compromised.
That's a monumental decision. It implies the court was trying to correct past procedural wrongs.
It does.
But the consequence of correcting a procedural error is that the families of the 24 people who died, they're left with no convictions, no closure.
And this is the intense dilemma you face when the judiciary has been so deeply politicized. The court, in its effort to uphold due process, inadvertently creates this massive, substantive, and political disaster. Justice is seen to be denied.
And the ruling itself, even if it's procedurally correct, is just viewed through the lens of political advantage.
Which just complicates the quest for trust and accountability even more. The event that shattered coexistence remains unresolved, and it confirms the system's deep dysfunction.
And this chronic inability to trust any democratic institution leads us directly into the core issue plaguing the country, which the Rajshahi University analysis calls the parochial political culture.
That concept is absolutely critical to understanding this. They define it as a political culture that is fundamentally destructive, low, and just antithetical to true democratic norms.
What does that mean in practice? Lacking patience, respect, cooperation.
Exactly. When we talk about destructive low conduct, what does that actually look like? Well, we see it start right at the beginning with candidate selection. It's defined by deeply entrenched dynastic and money politics.
So both parties, the AL and the BNP, are hugely centralized.
Immensely. Decision-making, especially nominating candidates, is entirely in the hands of the party leader and their inner circle.
So it's not based on merit or local engagement. It's about who has the most influence and, critically, the most money.
Precisely. And that's why the makeup of the parliament is so telling. Take this statistic from the 2024 election. 67% of the elected MPs were businessmen.
67%.
And it's not because businessmen are better politicians. It's because money and the ability to organize muscle and patronage networks are seen as essential for getting that nomination. It reinforces patron-client networks over actual democracy.
So what's the core problem with having so many businessmen in parliament beyond just a lack of political experience?
It's the mechanism of corruption. Analysts note that these individuals spend huge sums of money, often from loans they never intend to repay, to secure their seats.
And once they're elected, they have to make that money back plus a profit.
And they do that by using their political office to collect illicit tolls, engage in industrial-scale corruption, secure favorable contracts, and get impunity for their illegal activities. The whole system is structurally designed for self-enrichment, not public service. It's a never-ending cycle.
And this institutional dysfunction, it doesn't start with candidate selection. When you look at the electoral process itself, the sheer scale of manipulation is staggering.
It's an institutionalized election engineering culture, and whichever party is in power deploys it. It's everything from gerrymandering to changing electoral rules right before a vote. And crucially, the Bangladesh Election Commission, the EC, which is supposed to be neutral,
Has been transformed into a highly politicized, controversial institution.
Exactly. Since 1991, ruling parties have made it a practice to appoint partisan commissioners, people with deep loyalty to their party to assure favorable outcomes. The very body meant to ensure fair elections becomes another instrument of control.
And the tools of suppression against the opposition are extensive.
Absolutely. The judicial system is weaponized. False cases against opponents are commonplace, sometimes numbering in the millions. They file cases against anonymous suspects just to suppress the opposition's ability to even campaign.
So the ruling party gets police protection for their rallies, but the opposition is denied the same spaces.
Routinely. It reinforces a completely deficient and unfair democratic culture.
And the malpractices just intensify at the polling stations themselves. It moves from the courts into the street.
The methods are brazen. First, you have the tactic of expelling the polling agents of opposition parties, often through arbitrary arrests. Then you have bogus or phantom votes and ballot box stuffing to manufacture a victory.
And the ultimate act of desperation is the physical hijacking of ballot boxes.
Yes. This happens if the ruling party realizes they're clearly losing in a specific area. They hijack the boxes, often destroying the ballots inside, forcing the election commission to cancel the vote there. It's the tactical use of violence to guarantee a result.
The outcome of all this is a parliament where the few people who do get elected under this system finally arrive. If the process is that corrupt, the conduct inside parliament must be equally dysfunctional.
It is. The analysis confirms parliament hasn't functioned properly since 1991. The endemic parochial culture resulted in what many call the dictatorship of the prime minister, where the executive branch just completely dominated the legislature.
Checks and balances just evaporated.
Right. So you see these extreme acts of hostility.
Yeah.
Dense walkouts, mass resignations like the opposition's mass resignation in 1994, and constant boycotts. The interrelationships are described as ungainly. Uproars, the famous file-hammered confrontations.
Where politicians are literally banging files on tables in anger.
And using outright indecent language at the speaker. The fundamental attitude is authoritarian, intolerant, and geared toward winning power by any means necessary.
And this adversarial zero-sum spirit doesn't stay confined to government buildings. It spills onto the streets as violence as policy.
The heavy reliance on hardle, these politically motivated national strikes, is the most damaging manifestation of this. They became the weaponized means for the opposition to try and abolish governments. The statistics on this are just staggering.
Let's put those numbers in context.
Okay. Between 1991 and 1996, there were 266 days of hardle.
266. That's nearly 9 months of nationwide shutdown in a 5-year period.
It is. And during the Awami League's time in opposition, between 2001 and 2007, they called for 173 days of hardle.
That's not political protest. That's devastating economic sabotage. How does a country even function under that?
It struggles immensely. This perpetual vandalism, burning vehicles, street violence, it devastates the daily life of citizens. Small businesses close, daily wage laborers lose their income, kids miss school, and the crucial export sector suffers.
And even when the government managed some policy success,
the opposition immediately responded with violent agitation. When the government signed the Ganges Water Treaty with India in 96, or the Chittagong Hill Tracts Peace Accord in 97, the opposition labeled them black treaties and called for more strikes.
It's truly a zero-sum game. The ruling party's success is seen by the opposition as their greatest vulnerability, something to be undermined immediately.
Exactly. The entire system has been structured to exclude the opposition and ensure the ruling party's survival. The fundamental question now is whether this interim reset period can sufficiently cleanse the system before the 2026 election just defaults back to this toxic rivalry.
Which brings us to this crucial interim period, ushered in by the mass uprising that forced Sheikh Hasina to flee in August 2024. And it's being led by Nobel laureate Mohammed Yunus. For many Bangladeshis, Yunus is seen as the adult in the room, a necessary cooling off period from all this historical toxicity.
He took office on August 8, 2024, tasked with facilitating what many hope will be a second liberation for the nation. A chance to correct the institutional flaws of the last 50 years.
His role is so unique, isn't it? He's a global figure with no personal political ambition.
Which is key. He's providing a crucial, fragile pause, a period of institutional remediation to allow the democratic foundations to be thoroughly rebuilt.
And he seems to have widespread public backing, which gives him a powerful form of legitimacy, even if the legal foundation for his government is complex.
That public mandate is his greatest political asset. A nationwide IRI survey in December 2025 showed overwhelming support. 69% approval for Yunus and 70% for the interim government's performance. That gives him the leverage he needs for these painful, slow reforms.
But let's talk about that tenuous legal basis, because this is where the timeline gets tricky. The Constitution says elections within 90 days, but we're looking at 12 to 18 months for the 2026 election. Why the long delay?
The government is operating outside the standard constitutional framework, relying on a Supreme Court advisory opinion and, most critically, the backing of the military and that popular legitimacy.
And the delay is just deemed necessary.
Absolutely necessary because of the sheer scale of the institutional wreckage left behind. The military chief himself, General Wakar-Uzzaman, publicly supported the extension. He said trying to hold a fair election in 90 days would just guarantee a return to the cycle of violence and fraud.
So the interim government's entire purpose is to create strong guardrails to prevent future autocracy. This brings us to their really ambitious reform agenda.
It is monumental in scope. The goal is to ensure the authoritarianism of the last 15 years cannot return. Yunus established 6 primary commissions focused on deep institutional reform.
Judiciary, electoral system, administration, police, corruption, and the Constitution.
And later added 4 more for things like health, media, labor rights, and women's affairs.
Let's start with the judiciary and administration, the institutions that were so explicitly weaponized.
Under Hasina, the courts were consistently used to cudgel political opponents. Judges feared retribution. You had hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of politically motivated cases filed against dissenters.
So the interim government's goal is to restore judicial independence.
Right. And that means specific measures. Abolishing executive control over judge selection, transferring or promoting hundreds of lower court judges to clear out partisan elements, and then the massive task of just dropping those millions of politically motivated cases.
But the security sector crisis, that sounds like the most urgent and dangerous issue they inherited. The sources describe the police as Hasina's attack dogs.
That's an accurate description. The police force was systematically stacked with loyalists, often recruited right from the Awami League student wings. They were a coercive enforcement arm of the party.
And when Hasina fled, that whole system just collapsed.
It did. Many police officers abandoned their posts, fearing reprisal from protesters. It led to a profound breakdown of law and order. About 250 deaths in that first week alone.
Which is why the military had to step in. A necessary evil, perhaps.
To restore order, they had to take the drastic measure of granting the army magistracy powers for 2 months. It meant army officers could issue arrest orders and search warrants. Controversial, but necessary to stabilize the country.
And now the deeper challenge is restoring trust in a police force that's completely demoralized.
Right. Officers are worried about being charged for past abuses committed on behalf of the old regime. Deep reform is needed there.
Okay, let's move to the economy. Hasina's regime was often praised internationally for an economic miracle, but the sources suggest a lot of that was an illusion.
In many ways, it was. We now know the government was manipulating key economic data. The World Bank estimated that roughly half of Bangladesh's reported GDP growth from 2015 to 2019 was unexplained.
Suggesting the numbers were just inflated.
Artificially inflated. Even export data was cooked, inflated by an estimated $10 billion in one fiscal year alone.
And the sheer scale of corruption just destabilized the whole financial sector.
The corruption became industrial-scale theft. It's estimated that well over $100 billion was laundered offshore over the past 15 years.
$100 billion.
Ruling party acolytes engaged in so much looting that some of the country's biggest private banks are now dangerously insolvent. This crony capitalism led to capital flight, a crisis of confidence, and surging inflation peaking near 15%, which acutely hurt the nation's poor.
So the interim government's immediate economic focus is just stabilization. Stop the bleeding.
They've moved decisively. They secured billions in support from the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB to shore up foreign reserves. They've appointed a respected former IMF official to head the central bank with a mandate to clean up the banking mess.
And the main priority is bringing down inflation.
That's the acute public concern that could quickly destabilize this fragile political peace.
Which leads us to the competing political factions that Yunus has to navigate. Despite his public approval, achieving lasting consensus among these groups is incredibly fragile.
There's consensus on needing checks and balances, but the first core fault line is the constitutional debate. The question is fundamental. Do you amend the existing 1972 charter, or do you pursue a complete rewrite?
What are the arguments for each side?
Well, many jurists and government insiders favor amending it. It's faster, it provides a continuous legal framework. But many student leaders and reform advocates, they want a complete rewrite. They argue the current charter is too flawed and abused to be the foundation for a true democracy.
And what about the BNP? With the Awami League in disarray, they're poised to win any election. They must be under huge pressure to push for one now.
It's a very delicate balancing act. The BNP leadership officially supports the reform delay. They recognize the disaster of returning to power without guardrails, but they have to control their grassroots base, which is hungry for an early poll.
They need to show they're not just a little better than the AL.
Exactly. They need to prioritize institutional credibility over immediate political gratification to secure that long-term public trust.
And the students who started the uprising, they remain a powerful force.
A potent bottom-up dynamic. They formed the National Citizens Committee to lobby for deep systemic change. Some are even calling for an outright ban on the Awami League, arguing the political culture is too polluted for them to compete right now.
The transition has also inadvertently increased the influence of Islamist groups that were suppressed under Hasina.
Hasina's regime heavily persecuted groups like Jamaat-e-Islami and Hafazat-e-Islam. Ironically, that brutal crackdown seems to have strengthened them. They now elicit a degree of sympathy as victims and are well placed to fill the political vacuum.
But doesn't engaging those groups immediately create a huge problem with the secular students who helped start the uprising? How does Yunus manage appointing, say, Jamaat-linked lawyers to the International Crimes Tribunal?
That is precisely the tightrope walk. The interim government recognizes that trying to completely exclude these organized, motivated groups is counterproductive. So engagement is seen as necessary.
Even if it's controversial.
It is. That appointment is a pragmatic move to signal inclusivity, but it deeply worries secular activists. It shows how every single reform decision carries heavy historical baggage.
Finally, you have this massive accountability dilemma, balancing the public demand for justice with the risk of just descending into another cycle of tit-for-tat vengeance.
The desire for swift revenge is strong. Yunus has sought Hasina's extradition and asked the UN to investigate recent atrocities. But the legal process playing out in local police stations is already highly problematic.
In what way?
Because the law requires police to accept criminal complaints, hundreds of cases of murder have been filed against Hasina and her senior officials. But many are deeply flawed mass public complaints, listing hundreds of defendants, many unidentified.
So the process is just ripe for abuse, for settling old political scores.
And it causes widespread fear among people with no genuine connection to the incidents. The government has to find a way to balance credible trials with this intense demand for speedy justice, without validating another round of politically motivated prosecutions.
So the entire stability of the next decade really hinges on the success of this interim period.
Precisely. The end of the Battle of the Begums has provided this undeniable critical opportunity for renewal. The old paralyzing binary is gone. There's a massive mandate for structural change.
But that pervasive parochial political culture we talked about, that institutionalized destruction, threatens to undermine the whole thing. The system is fighting back.
Even under new leadership like Tariq Rahman, the potential for reverting to that cycle of exclusion and retaliation remains the central threat. The weight of history is immense.
The role of the interim government, then, it's not to deliver a perfect democracy.
No. It's to provide a stable, cooling-off period to allow those institutional foundations to be rebuilt. Their success is in creating a platform for a democratic future that can tolerate dissent without seeing the other side as an existential enemy to be destroyed.
If we look back at the entire history of Bangladesh, there's this profound overarching lesson, isn't there? The forces that sought to undermine democracy back in 1971, the defeated anti-liberation forces, they have historically thrived solely on the permanent hostility between the Awami League and the BNP.
If that rivalry is eternal, the space for extremism, for anti-democratic forces, remains perpetually open. For the 2026 transition to succeed, and for the nation to achieve a stable future, the fundamental requirement isn't ideological agreement. That's impossible. Instead, it requires a strategic, tolerant coexistence. The greatest danger is allowing that deep historical division to persist, because if it does, it creates the precise political vacuum required for anti-state forces and extremism to rise and fill that gap. The fate of Bangladesh really rests on whether this new generation can prioritize the integrity of the state over the pursuit of vengeance.